Hi, everybody. It's Tuesday, and today we're finishing the civil rights movement in America. There is an assignment in the Edmodo file labeled Distance Learning Homework, something like that, Homework for Distance Learning, and it's an excerpt from one of my favorite authors, James Baldwin. James Baldwin is an African-American civil rights leader who spoke in a way that was very relatable. And the excerpt is from his last interview in 1961. And there's only 2 questions at the end. And so for those of you who seek to help out your grade, this is a fairly easy and actually, I think it's very educational. I think James Baldwin is a household name. If you know who Keanu Reeves is, you should also know who James Baldwin is. And if you only know one over the other, you have a very limited view of the historical record. So go learn who James Baldwin is and become a more complete person. We begin on slide 24 today in the Civil Rights Movement lesson. If you're following along on the notes on Edmodo, we know that there was progress made. We know that the president himself helped James Meredith stay out of trouble and go to class at Ole Miss. We know that the president, Kennedy, helped Dr. King get out of jail in Birmingham, Alabama. We know that so those are 2 examples of executive action promoting civil rights. The Brown versus Board of Education legal case in front of the Supreme Court saw judicial action as well. And so the legislative component of this is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. My wife and I had a conversation today about the Civil Rights Act. She wanted to know the second half of the story. She wanted to know how the 2018-2019 current administration rollbacks of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 have affected us. She did not end up happy. You can Google this yourself. It is unfortunate that in the last 3.5 years, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has been rolled back an awful lot. So I would argue that the civil rights movement is still underway, and there is much progress to be done, and to be done again. In Selma, Alabama, in the 1960s, the National Guard had to be called out to protect protesters because there were. Okay, you're on my video now.
Sorry.
So congratulations. Say hi to my family, everybody.
Hi.
Say hi to the viewers.
Hi.
They went for a walk.
Yeah,
so
slap me if I do that.
we're trying to get outside, which is, you should too. You should try to get outside. So the National Guard was called out in Alabama to protect protesters because there was a threat of violence. In 1965, President Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it will ban literacy tests and ban other barriers to voting. Are there still barriers to voting today? Well, as I record this, which is a week earlier, Wisconsin went to the polls, and they tried to vote in the middle of this coronavirus event, and I'm not 100% sure why any political party would think this is the right day to go voting, but it happened, and we'll let history be the judge of it. The important part about the civil rights legislation of the 1960s is enforcement. We know that prohibition didn't work because of a lack of enforcement. We know that the Volstead Act was the enforcement provision of the prohibition, and it was only enforced 5% in New York City, so they abandoned prohibition, but it was enforced 95% in Kansas, so they maintained prohibition. Without enforcement, a law will not succeed. And Johnson enforced the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I think it's clear that today there is no enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 based on the rollbacks in yesterday's video and what you could Google yourself in the 2018-2019 events. So change, of course, is incremental. I mean, when we look at the degree of change over time, as a nation, we began with slavery. Hundreds of thousands of people died to end slavery. Jim Crow was a reality for 99 years plus. The pervasive institutionalized racism that followed can still be seen in some ways today through the maintenance of gerrymandering, but that change continues to occur. I mean, change is a reality over time. At no point can we end up in the same institutions that our grandparents had, because those institutions no longer exist. So Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize for his leadership, and was recognized. His work was recognized as some of the most important of his era. The next slide suggests that James Baldwin was important. Your homework today will reinforce that. He wrote extensively on the subject. Eventually, he ended the latter part of his life in France because there were a lot of segments of America that did not welcome him. But he wrote that the Negro no longer believes in the good faith of white Americans. Well, and for good reason. Institutionalized racism had been a reality since the founding of America up until, well, my lifetime. I was born in 64, and the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 tried to break down those institutions that maintained racism. So we're really not far that removed from some of the things that we had that we no longer wanted to keep. The next slide, 28, talks about Malcolm Little. Malcolm Little is the son of a Baptist minister who spread a Back to Africa message. It didn't go very well because if African Americans went to Africa, the challenge is they'd never been there before. It's not really a Back to Africa event for any African American who would go, at least someone born here, because they didn't speak the language, they didn't have agricultural skills for African agriculture. He is eventually going to become an adherent of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam has some specificity in their belief system. It would be inappropriate to say that the Nation of Islam follows Islam. They have their own individual beliefs, and you can look that up on your own. But he'll change his name. Malcolm Little will change his name to Malcolm X and preach black separation and self-help. This is a form of black nationalism that says that the black community can do things for the black community without the help of white people. And this self-help and separation movement was not an effort to take things from the white community, but instead to encourage the black community to provide for the black community. Malcolm X, is going to reject Dr. King's satyagraha methods. I hope you remember that satyagraha was a Gandhi term that means nonviolent opposition. And they also reject integration into a larger American society, because often that integration of black America into white America saw an unequal integration through which African Americans were in a subordinate relationship economically with white America. After a pilgrim, and he rejected the nonviolent methods and even suggested that violence could be a way to advance the cause of black separation and self-help. After a pilgrimage to Mecca, he is going to come back to America and be far more cooperative, far less angry in his philosophy, but the damage had been done. He had created a following that had devoted themselves to the potential of violence to create change. And in 1965, he was killed. 3 Nation of Islam members were charged with the murder, but his message had already been well received. Stokely Carmichael is going to be one of the new leaders of a wave of African American movements, like the Black Power movement. In fact, Stokely Carmichael will be associated with the Black Panthers, who will support the Malcolm X message through the next generation of leadership. And the Black Panthers are unique in their ideology in the African American community because they will read such notable philosophers as Mao Zedong. And if your parents are listening, they're probably going to be horrified by my suggestion that Mao is a philosopher in any way. But Mao Zedong said, "Power flows from the barrel of a gun." And I would ask you to consider whether or not that is true. In the slide that you see associated with this idea, you see some Black Panthers setting up with guns in front of a political party headquarters. They will establish daycare centers. They establish food programs and food pantries. The Black Panthers are not simply an angry black organization that seeks change. They really do live out the self-help and separation ideology of Malcolm X. They believe that the roots of inequality were economic in nature. I'm going to slow down here and ask you to consider, are the roots of inequality economic in nature? And does power flow from the barrel of a gun? If you take those sentences in isolation and ask yourself, what do they mean? You may arrive at some fairly challenging answers when applied to different questions about society, as the Black Panthers did. I'm not suggesting they're right. I'm suggesting that they had a unique situation. In fact, their economic disparity could be considered an economic reality that caused political change. I mean, we know that radical economic conditions create radical economic consequences, and I would argue that the poverty of the African American community was a radical economic condition that led to a radical political philosophy seen through Malcolm X. And that, by the way, is an excellent essay if I were preparing myself for the AP test. So, despite a lot of challenges in the civil rights movement, change does occur. It does occur a little bit slowly. In 1966, Barbara Jordan is the first African American to be elected to the Texas Senate since Reconstruction. And 6 years later, she's elected to the U.S. House from Texas. So, if Texas can change, anybody can change. Now, is the civil rights movement over? I would suggest that no economic that it's not over, that economic and social disparity still exists. We are still seeing some broad grassroots movements underway even today to try to challenge stereotypical norms economically and politically. And one of the challenges we had in the 1950s and 60s is that change was occurring quickly. And we've seen this in the past. You remember that conversation about how Japan changed technologically in a short period of time and had trouble keeping up sociologically? Well, that same dynamic occurred in the United States. In one generation, we moved from the musket to the hydrogen bomb. And can any society really keep up with that? And when you add the social differences, the social changes into the mix, it's difficult for that generation that grew up that was older in the 50s and 60s to see so much changing in front of their eyes. In fact, the image here on the slide is from the movie 12 Angry Men. And the prejudice demonstrated by those characters, if you've seen that movie, is one of the cornerstones of the changing culture, economics, and politics of the 1950s and 60s. So by the end of the 1960s, end of the 50s certainly, and into the 60s, we've become a consumer society. We've created markets around the world through the Marshall Plan. We've become an integrated society. Once the military is integrated, Brown versus Board of Education happens. The Ole Miss is now integrated. You can't go back after that. We are a generation then in the 60s, 50s and 60s that did not win a war. For the first time in our history, there's a war that we were not able to conclude successfully. There were false accusations of communism, suggestions of corruption in government. America's favorite president, half of us favored him. There was an assassination on his life. And TV comes into American homes and shows the moral ambiguity of reality. We all have this perfect philosophy and ideology, but when there's real people we know in real situations that are not so black and white, we see life to be far less certain. And those are the elements that characterize a post-industrial society. So, good news. Tomorrow we get to talk about hippies and the Vietnam War and the countercultural revolution. And you have an opportunity through that assignment in the folder on Edmodo labeled Homework for Remote Learning to meet James Baldwin. I highly encourage you to meet James Baldwin. If you're going to go to college and you don't know who James Baldwin is when you get to college, even the COVID-19 kids who go to college with one semester less, you're going to be a bit embarrassed if you don't know who James Baldwin is. That's like saying you don't know who Maya Angelou is. I would not want to be you in that social situation. So check him out, find out who James Baldwin is, and I will see you tomorrow.